caused by the angles of the sun's light hitting the moon. They maintain that the moon is a reflector of the sun's light. But as we're going to see in this episode, as I go through the book by Dr. Samuel Robenham, Zetetic Astronomy, that's not the case. Biblically speaking, the Book of Enoch would lead you to believe that the moon is self-illuminating. It is not reflecting light. So if the phases of the moon are not caused by the shadow of the Earth, what about the lunar eclipse? Now, that one everybody seems to understand to be the result of the moon going into the Earth's shadow, as depicted here. You have the Earth's penumbra and the Earth's umbra. And as the moon starts to go into the umbra side of it, that's where somehow the dark shadow of the Earth makes the moon turn red. Like, that even makes sense. But that's what we're taught. That's what all the charts and everything show. But is that really the case? Well, let's see. This author points out some really interesting things regarding lunar eclipses and solar eclipses as well. It says, beginning on page 101, causes of solar and lunar eclipses. A solar eclipse is a result simply of the moon passing between the sun and the observer on Earth. But that an eclipse of the moon arises from a shadow of the Earth is a statement in every respect, because unproved, unsatisfactory. The Earth has been proved to be without orbital or axial motion, and therefore it could never come between the sun and the moon. The Earth is also proved to be a plane, always underneath the sun and moon, and therefore to speak of its intercepting the light of the sun and thus casting its own shadow on the moon is to say that which is physically impossible. And this also gets into the whole issue of self-illumination. And we've talked about that in previous shows, but the ancient texts do not in any way support the idea that the moon is receiving her light from the sun. It says that she's giving or causing her own light. So the phases are internal, not external. Dr. Robenham goes on to say, besides the above difficulties or incompatibilities, many cases are on record of the sun and moon being eclipsed when both were above the horizon. That's a big problem. The sun, the earth, and the moon not in a straight line, but the earth below the sun and moon, out of the reach or direction of both, and yet a lunar eclipse has occurred. Is it possible that a shadow of the earth could be thrown upon the moon when sun, earth, and moon were not in the same line? The difficulty has been met by assuming the influence of refraction, as in the following quotations. And he's citing somebody here. It says, on some occasions, the horizontal refraction amounts to 36 or 37 minutes, and generally to about 33 minutes, which is equal to the diameter of the sun or moon, and therefore the whole disk of the sun or moon will appear above the horizon, both at rising and setting, although actually below. This is the reason that the full moon has sometimes been seen above the horizon before the sun was set. A remarkable instance of this kind was observed at Paris on the 19th of July, 1750, when the moon appeared visibly eclipsed, while the sun was distinctly to be seen above the horizon. That's a quote from Astronomy and Astronomical Instruments by George G. Gary. Another quote here. On the 20th of July, 1837, the moon appeared to rise eclipsed before the sun had set. The same phenomenon was observed on the 20th of September, 1717. That's from McCulloch's Geography, page 85. Let's see, he's got another one here. In the lunar eclipses of July 17th, 1590, November 3rd, 1648, June 16th, 1666, and May 26, 1668, the moon rose eclipsed, whilst the sun was still apparently above the horizon. Those horizontal eclipses were noticed as early as the time of Pliny. That's according to the Illustrated London Almanac for 1864, the astronomical articles in which are by James Glacier, ESQ of the Greenwich Royal Observatory, page 99. Another citation. On the 17th of January, 1870, a similar phenomena occurred, and again in July of the same year. That's the reference there is the Daily Telegraph, July 16th, 1870. The only explanation which has been given of this phenomenon is the refraction caused by the Earth's atmosphere. This at first sight is a plausible and fairly satisfactory solution, but on carefully examining the subject, it is found to be utterly inadequate. And those who have recourse to it cannot be aware that the refraction of an object and that of a shadow are in opposite directions. An object by refraction is bent upwards, but the shadow of any object is bent downwards, as will be seen by the following very simple experiment. Take a plain white shallow basin and place it 10 or 12 inches from a light in such a position that the shadow of the edge of the basin touches the center of the bottom. Hold a rod vertically over and on the edge of the shadow to denote its true position. Now let water be gradually poured into the basin, and the shadow will be seen to recede or shorten inwards and downwards. But if a rod or a spoon is allowed to rest, with its upper end towards the light and the lower end in the bottom of the vessel, it will be seen as the water is poured in to bend upwards, thus proving that if refraction operated at all, it would do so by elevating the moon above its true position and throwing the Earth's shadow downwards or directly away from the moon's surface. Hence it is clear that a lunar eclipse by a shadow of the Earth is an utter impossibility. The moon's entire surface, or that portion of it which is presented to the Earth, has also been distinctly seen during the whole time of a total lunar eclipse. This is entirely incompatible with the doctrine that an eclipse of the moon is the result of a shadow of the Earth passing over its surface. Mr. Walker, who observed the lunar eclipse on March 19, 1848, near Collumpton, says, "The appearances were as usual till 20 minutes past 9. At that period, and for the space of the next hour, instead of an eclipse, or the shadow umbra of the Earth being the cause of the total obscurity of the moon, the whole face of that body became very quickly and most beautifully illuminated, and assumed the appearance of the glowing heat of fire from the furnace, rather tinged with a deep red, the whole disk of the moon being as perfect with light as if there had been no eclipse whatever. The moon positively gave good light from its disk during the total eclipse." That's from Philosophical Magazine number 220 from August 1848. The following case, although not exactly similar to the last, is worth recording here as showing that some other cause existed than the Earth's shadow to produce a lunar eclipse. He cites somebody here saying, "Extraordinary phenomena attending the eclipse. On Saturday evening, February 27th, 1858, at Brussels, the eclipse was seen by several English philosophers who happened to be present. It was attended by a very remarkable appearance, which Dr. Foster said was wholly inexplicable on any laws of natural philosophy with which he was acquainted. The moment before contact, a small dusky spot appeared on the moon's surface, and during the whole of the eclipse, a reddish-brown fringe, or penumbra, projected above the shadow of the Earth. Another thing still more remarkable was the apparent irregularity of the edge of the shadow. 3 persons, one of them an astronomer, were witnesses of these curious phenomena, which no law of refraction can in any way explain." That's a quote from Morning Star of Wednesday, March 3rd, 1858. The author continues, "The several cases above advanced are logically destructive of the notion that an eclipse of the moon arises from a shadow of the Earth. As before stated, the Earth is proved to be a plane without motion and always several hundred miles below the sun and moon, and cannot, by any known possibility, come between them. It cannot therefore intercept the light of the sun and throw its own shadow upon the moon. If such a thing were a natural possibility, how could the moon continue to shine during the whole or any considerable part of the period of its passage through the dark shadow of the Earth? Refraction, or what has been called earth light, will not aid in the explanation, because the light of the moon is at such times like the glowing heat of fire tinged with deep red. Reddish is not the word to express it. It was red hot. The reddish light made it seem to be on fire. It looked like a fire smoldering in its ashes. Its tint was that of red-hot copper. Those were all quotes. The sunlight is of an entirely different color to that of the eclipsed moon, and it is contrary to known optical principles to say that light, when refracted or reflected, or both simultaneously, is thereby changed in color. If a light of a given color is seen through a great depth of comparatively dense medium, as the sun is often seen in winter through the fog or vapor of the atmosphere, it appears of a different color, and generally of such as that which the moon so often gives during a total eclipse. But a shadow cannot produce any such effect, as it is in fact not an entity at all, but simply the absence of light. From the facts and phenomena already advanced, we cannot draw any other conclusion than that the moon is obscured by some kind of semi-transparent body passing before it, and through which the luminous surface is visible. The luminosity changed in color by the density of the intervening object. This conclusion is forced upon us by the evidence, but it involves the admission that the moon shines with light of its own, that it is not a reflector of the sun's light, but absolutely self-luminous. Although this admission is logically compulsory, it will be useful and strictly zetetic to collect all the evidence possible which bears upon it. First, a reflector is a plane or concave surface which gives off or returns what it receives. If a piece of red-hot metal or any other heated object is placed before a plane or concave surface, heat is reflected. If snow or ice or any artificial freezing mixture is similarly placed, cold will be reflected. If light of any given color is placed in the same way, the same color of light will be reflected. If a given sound is produced, the same tone or pitch will be reflected. A reflector will not throw off cold when heat is placed before it, nor heat when cold is presented. If a red light is received, red light will be returned, not blue or yellow. If the note C is sounded upon any musical instrument, a reflector will not return the note D or G, but precisely the same note when altered only in degree and intensity. If the moon is a reflector of the sun's light, she could not radiate or throw down upon the earth any other light than such as she first receives from the sun. No difference could exist in the quality of character of the light, and it could not possibly differ in any other respect than that of intensity or quantity. It has been asserted in opposition to the above that the moon might absorb some of the rays of light from the sun and reflect only the remaining rays. To this, it is replied that absorption means speedy saturation. A piece of blotted paper, or a lump of hard sugar, or a sponge, when brought into contact with any fluid or gaseous substance, would only absorb for a short time. It would quickly become saturated, filled to repletion, and from that moment would cease to absorb, and ever afterwards could only reflect or throw back whatever was projected upon it. So the moon, if an object without light of her own, might at the beginning of her existence absorb the sun's rays, and fixing some might return the others, but as already shown, she could only absorb to saturation, which would occur in a very short time, and from this point of saturation to the present moment, she could only have been other than a reflector too, of all which she receives. We have then, in order to know whether the moon is a reflector, merely to ascertain whether the light which we receive from her is or is not the same in character as that received from the sun. And due to the lack of time we have left in this broadcast, I'm not going to continue, probably to your great joy and my terrible reading of this. But this author goes on to describe the many differences in the type of light that comes from the sun and the type of light that comes from the moon. And as I said earlier, this author is quite thorough in his explanations and experiments. And he goes on to describe various ancient cultures that talk about a dark object that is also part of our solar system.